Welcome to chessopenings.com. Today I'm going to introduce main ideas in the Queen's Gambit, which begins with the moves pawn to d4, pawn to d5, and pawn to c4. The Queen's Gambit is a gradual, strategic opening in which white is aiming to get a slight advantage in space in the beginning phase of the game, and only later gradually develop it into an attack. Let's take a look. After the moves pawn to d4, pawn to d5, pawn to c4, white is threatening to gain a central majority and extra time with this move pawn takes pawn on d5. Now, it's natural to ask, what happens if black accepts the gambit with d takes c4? In fact, this is no longer a very popular option, but it's still quite viable, and it's known as the Queen's Gambit Accepted, or the QGA for short. And this is exactly what I'd like to talk about today. The very first point that every good chess student should know is that black cannot hold on to the pawn. For example, after the move pawn to e3, black would be in bad shape if he tried to hold on to this pawn with the move pawn to b5. White wins the pawn back by playing a4, attacking these pawns, breaking these things down. And if black plays a6, well, we have a pin, right? So that move just didn't do anything at all. And if he were to try pawn to c6, he would actually run into a really nasty trap here. Pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn. And now b3 would be sufficient to regain material, but instead, white also has queen to f3, just picking up material. Black has no choice but to give up a knight here on c6. So this is a really, really bad idea for black, and because of ideas like this, ideas like the ones I've shown, black actually does not try to hold on to the pawn on c4. So he's accepting this gambit, but only temporarily. White will be able to recapture the pawn. Now, right away, there's a couple interesting questions which arise. If black knows that white will eventually be able to recover the pawn on c4, why does he play the Queen's Gambit Accepted? Isn't it a good idea to hold on to our central pawns and not trade them for flank pawns? We're going to see the answer to this in just a moment. A second question which might arise is, why doesn't white go ahead and occupy the square e4 immediately with his pawn as opposed to e3? This is another interesting question, and in describing the answers to these two questions, we're going to gain some real strategic insight into the Queen's Gambit Accepted. First, let's talk about why black chooses to play the Queen's Gambit Accepted, even though white will eventually recover the pawn. Black's strategy is to avoid getting bogged down in defending the d-pawn so that he can devote his efforts to attacking white in the center with a counter break of his own, which is generally pawn to c5. Since black has not spent any time defending the d5 pawn, he keeps his options maximally open to strike at white's center at the first convenient moment. An excellent example of this occurs in the main line after knight f3, knight f6, e3, e6, bishop takes pawn, and now black plays pawn to c5. And this is really interesting because if you think about it, black is applying the exact same strategy as white did on move 2. White played c4 to attack black's d-pawn, and now, later, after these moves, it turns out that black's applying the exact same strategy. He's using his c-pawn to attack white's d-pawn. In fact, if white also plays pawn takes pawn now or later, and believe it or not, he quite often does, well, let's just imagine that black recaptures, and you'll see that we get to an exactly symmetrical structure. Both sides have played the exact same moves with their pawns. So what we'll often see, though, is that white does sometimes choose to take on c5, leading to the symmetrical formation, or he waits for black to capture on d4 and accepts an isolated pawn in exchange for piece activity and extra space. This second strategy is a bit more popular than capturing on c5. Now, we've begun to touch on our second question, which is, why doesn't white just go ahead and occupy the e4 square with his pawn after black played pawn takes pawn? And as we just saw, white is anticipating that black is going to attack the d4 square with pawn to c5. And for this reason, we're reserving the e-pawn in case we want to play pawn to e3, as we often do. Now, this doesn't mean that pawn to e4 isn't a bad move, it just has some drawbacks, which is that both of the pawns might end up being vulnerable. They can be struck at with various pawn breaks or even piece activity, as we'll get a chance to see in a moment. So, after the aggressive move pawn to e4, Black has 4 moves which allow him to kind of tickle some of these weaknesses which White has in the center. The most direct move is pawn to e5, going straight for the d4 point right away. Now, ideally, White would want to continue with either pawn takes pawn or advance the pawn to d5, but they both lead to an absolute mess here. For example, pawn takes pawn, and now Black's going to rip the queens off the board and remove castling rights from White. And he shouldn't really have any problems recovering this e5 pawn, and he's going to play, for instance, bishop g4, and he's going to castle queenside, and this is already an unpleasant situation for White, who just, the king is floating around in the center, and we've lost control over the position very quickly. The other idea that you might end up with then would be to advance the pawn to d5, but now the pawns are fixed and they become really easy targets for Black. So Black plays knight to f6, knight c3, and c6, so he's got several attackers on this d5 point. White captures on c4, and it looks like maybe we've consolidated things. Maybe we've held on to some advantage here, but Black has a great maneuver here. He just plays pawn to b5. And we can't afford to put our bishop anywhere but b3 because we've got to keep observation of the d5 pawn. So bishop b3, but now just pawn to b4. And these pawns are looking very shaky. It's going to be very difficult to find a way for White to find adequate compensation for this attack on his center. So it's very difficult to play in these ways, but theory suggests that White is doing okay and maybe even still has a slight advantage if he just plays knight to f3 in this position. And I want to emphasize that again, this position is perfectly viable for White. It's just not the most popular, classical way for White to play against the Queen's Gambit accepted. To give you some other ideas, let's look at knight to f6 attacking the e4 pawn. And this is baiting White into playing e5, as he quite often does. And now knight d5, bishop takes pawn, knight b6, bishop to b3, knight c6. This sets up a funny little trap, which is that if we play knight to f3, Black's ready to pin us and continue the attack on the pawn. So White often plays knight to e2 here, avoiding the pin. Then now bishop to f5, knight bc3, e6. This is starting to look good for Black. Black's got his bishop out of the pawn chain. He's fixed the pawns, so he's ready to always attack at some point with f6, these pawns here. And so White often plays a3, avoiding maneuvers on the b4 square. Queen d7, castle short, castle's long. And after bishop e3, pawn to f6. And again, by baiting these pawns forward into fixed positions, Black has managed to get an attack on these pawns. This is not a bad position for White. Again, it's just a little bit different from the classical situation which we're trying to get with White with the Queen's Gambit accepted. And this more or less starts to explain why White often refrains from pawn to e4. Now, another quick thing I want to discuss here is that White often doesn't even play pawn to e3 right away. And this is because Black has a little trick that I really don't want to describe too much in this position, but he can play pawn to e5 here. And this creates some funny little issues for White that he's not used, that he really doesn't want to answer. So, after all that explanation, we now understand why White's preferred move in this position is knight f3. He's going to play e3 next move, but he's eliminating tricks pawn to e5, and he's going to play this more gradually. He's not going to just try to blow Black up in the center right away. He's just going to gradually rely upon his space advantage in the center. A very classical strategy. And now after the standard book move knight f6, we play e3, intending to regain the pawn. And now after e6, bishop takes pawn, c5, Black has executed his central thrust. White's standard response here is to castle kingside. And now this is a situation for Black. He needs to figure out how he's going to continue his development. Again, if he develops just, for instance, bishop e7, this looks like a great time to capture on c5, as we'll discuss in a moment. So Black's not that excited about moving the bishop quite yet. Instead, his most common move is a6, preparing to bring out the light squared bishop with pawn to b5 and bishop to b7. This is one of the key positions in the Queen's Gambit accepted. Now, in this key position, there are several ways white can continue, but they tend to fall into two categories. Those in which white captures on c5, and those in which white waits for black to capture on d4. Now, if white captures on c5 right away, he already gives black a couple little headaches. After, for example, bishop takes pawn, queen takes queen, and king takes queen. Black's king is in the center. This gives white the chance to develop his rook with tempo, harassing the king. And secondly, white retains his white to move. It's not a lot in this position, but it's actually enough for white to drum up some serious attacking chances if he knows how to handle the position. And the theory revolves around whether black can attain equality in this position, or whether white can get a nagging advantage that he can use towards the endgame. White has another method to handle these positions. He can encourage black to take on d4, since after pawn takes pawn, he gains scope for his bishop on c1, as well as a half-open e-file. This leads to the famous isolated queen's pawn situation, which we've talked about so much in these videos. The pawn may turn out to be weak in the long run, but in the short run, it's great for providing white's pieces with outposts, open files, and with attacking chances. Of course, since it's white's move in this position, let's show an example of one of the main lines, which continues a4, getting rid of this b5 idea, knight c6, queen to e2, very logical move, preparing to bring the rook to d1. And now pawn takes pawn, rook d1, bishop to e7, pawn takes pawn, there's that isolated queen's pawn, castles, and knight c3. When white has extra space in the center, and he has more scope for his pieces, for example, look at the difference between the queen's bishops on both sides. One bishop has plenty of scope, the other is practically stalemated, it just has one square and nothing to do after that. This is one way that white's advantage in space is expressed. On the other hand, white does have weaknesses on d4 and on d5. And in this position, he also has a weak square on b4, and often black plays the knight to b4 and gains extra access to the d5 square. Over the long term, black hopes to prove that these are the most important factors. And so the theory here is a struggle as to whether white's attacking chances will eventually win out, or will black be able to play for an endgame and control of the center and eventually prove that this is a weak pawn. There are some other popular and interesting ways for white to play against the Queen's Gambit accepted, but I hope that in this video we've managed to look at some of the most important ones and get a really good idea for some of the strategic content of the Queen's Gambit accepted. The Queen's Gambit accepted is a viable alternative for players who want to play very solid for black, who are okay with defending patiently and waiting for the opponent to go a little bit wrong, as there are definitely some chances for black to get some good play, especially in the isolated queen's pawn positions. On the other hand, with white, this is a bit of a happy situation. It turns out that white can often get some good play without much risk, and this is very appealing for white. Based on these lines, though, if you really take a moment to let these ideas sink in and you maybe review this video a couple of times, you'll be able to understand more why black tends to choose openings like the Queen's Gambit declined or the Slav in response to the Queen's Gambit. We'll very much so be able to understand why black prefers to delay taking on c4 and only later play for setups like this after he's achieved a somewhat more comfortable situation. We'll get a chance to see that in other videos of the Queen's Gambit, but until next time, I can't wait to see you again.